Morning. I'm David Wessel, Director of the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy here at the Brookings Institution. We are here today to talk about opportunity zones, a provision of the 2017 tax bill that led to the creation of 8,764 census tracts across the country that are designated as tax havens. Opportunity zones offer a capital gains tax break to induce people with money to put that money in capital-starved, left-behind neighborhoods. It's the subject of my new book, Only the Rich Can Play. Now, this is a story about how Washington works in this new Gilded Age, how a billionaire, Sean Parker, one of the founders of Facebook, had an idea, a hack as he calls it, funded a startup think tank, and actually got a provision into law with a big assist from Tim Scott, and with no hearings and very little serious scrutiny of the details. This is a story about a tax break conceived as a way to help poor folks that was designed and implemented, in my view, in a way that made it easy for legions of accountants, tax lawyers, financial advisors, and money managers to exploit, to cut taxes for their wealthy clients without having to show or even assert that these investments actually lift up the communities in which they are located. But this is also a story about a tax break that can be, and as we'll hear shortly, is used to tackle the distress in America's left behind communities. But a story about what happens when there's such antipathy to government oversight and no requirement that a provision like this be used for its stated purpose, that you get condos, office towers, self-storage facilities, luxury housing, and census tracts that qualify only because the census counts college kids as poor since they don't have any income. And to be clear, frankly, this is just a good story. I mean, how lucky can a reporter get? It's a story about a tax provision, but we've got Sean Parker and his sidekick, Michael Polanski, who's dating Lady Gaga. We have Tim Scott confronting Donald Trump on Charlottesville. We have Nevada politicians lobbying US Treasury Secretary to bend the rules. We have an NFL player turned motivational speaker hired by the Trump White House to proselytize for opportunity zones. We have intrigue at the state capitol in Annapolis. We have a Ritz-Carlton going up with opportunity zone money in Portland, Oregon. Anthony Scaramucci makes an appearance, and there's even an Andy Warhol painting, but you'll have to read the book to find out what that's all about. So I'm very grateful today to have invited Jim Tankersley to interview me for about 20 minutes on the book. Jim is a very prolific White House correspondent for the New York Times, focusing on economic policy, and he's written about opportunity zones from the very start. He's the author of a book called The Riches of This Land, The Untold True Story of America's Middle Class, which, among other things, demonstrates that Jim has saved the notes from every interview he's ever done in 20 years of reporting. So, Jim, welcome to the Hutchins Center virtual stage.
David, thanks so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be here and interviewing you, and thanks to Brookings for putting this on. I think it's going to be a great discussion, and it's a topic that I have been fascinated with from the start, but I want to take sort of a writer's privilege and ask you some writer questions at the beginning, because this book comes together and comes from, I think, a very interesting place. Tell me how you got into opportunity zones and decided to start telling the story of them sort of in real time as they unfolded.
That's a great question, Jim. So I first heard about opportunity zones from one of my colleagues at Brookings, Adam Looney, who was frothing at the mouth about how outrageous they were. And Adam has a habit of doing that about many tax provisions. So I listened and nodded. And then he mentioned Sean Parker was involved. And suddenly I saw there was a story here, or there might be. So the first thing I did was go to Las Vegas to an Opportunity Zone Expo. I hadn't decided to do the book, but I decided that if I did the book and I hadn't gone to an Opportunity Zone Expo at the Mandalay Bay and Resort in Las Vegas, I would always regret it. And it was there that I realized how fascinating a story it was. It was like attending a modern day gold rush. There were so many people there, so hungry for details about opportunity zones. This is May 2019. So many colorful characters, all of whom were just dying to tell their story as I took notes in my notebook. And so that's how I got going. I have to admit that part of my plan was to use this as an opportunity to travel around the country. I got interrupted in that by COVID, which is a shame. But I still think I met a lot of interesting people who work in the field of community development, people who are in the real estate business who just love to talk. And so that's how I did it.
And tell me sort of what did you go in thinking was the story of how the zones were working and sort of what sort of impact they might have, and how did that change as your reporting evolved?
So, although I think the proponents of opportunity zones probably doubt this, I really was kind of agnostic. I knew a little bit about place-based tax policies, which of course go back to Margaret Thatcher and enterprise zones. And I had a great conversation with one of my colleagues at Brookings, Stuart Butler, who was previously at the Heritage Foundation and had been very involved in bringing the concept from the UK to the US. I had some skepticism, as anybody would, about a tax break that is so obviously designed to appeal to investors. I'd say I soured on it a little as I went along, only because I saw how easy it was for people to take advantage of the tax break without having to demonstrate that they were helping the people in the community. Then, of course, I met some people who were kind of disappointed. And then I met some people like Martin Muoto, who we'll talk to shortly, who showed how it could be used. There's just no requirement to do it the way it was sold.
So I think, it's fascinating. I got into Opportunity Zone coverage because I have for a long time been writing about sort of these areas of the country that have been left behind by the changes in the economy. And, on a sort of here's the problem to solve level, it's really hard to argue with, right? This is an attempt to drive private capital in to solve, a problem of underinvestment. To tell me in your sort of reporting where you think the trouble with the solution started. Was it in the design of the program in the law? Was it in the implementation? Both? How does it?
Yeah, all of the above. Look, this is a story about how Washington really works. And so while I think we should all welcome public spirited billionaires like Sean Parker, I don't think we should let them draft tax bills. And in a sense, that's what happened here. I think, as you point out, the idea is incredibly appealing. And I think that's one reason why they got so much bipartisan support. Who could be against getting rich people to put money into poor neighborhoods? And if it takes a little tax incentive to do that, so much the better. But I think that the problem here was the proponents were so certain that previous attempts at this had failed because there was too much red tape and too much government regulation that they went too far in the other direction. And that what we've seen is that with so many opportunity zones across the country, some of them chosen rather foolishly by governors in those states, the money naturally flowed to the places that were least likely to need it. And that's what concerns me. I don't think that the Trump Treasury did a particularly good job of implementing the law and writing the regulations. There's a lot of, in any tax provision, there's lots of opportunities for the reg writers to do things. I don't think they took very many opportunities, although I don't think the law gave them as much authority as some people at the Treasury would have liked. So I would say, A, it was flawed in design. B, because it got kind of slipped into the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it didn't get the scrutiny that you get at hearings or the public vetting by experts who may not be sympathetic, but can sometimes make a proposal better, was not well implemented. And then what I think the proponents just didn't appreciate how good the tax avoidance community is at finding ways to exploit the weaknesses in the law and the regulations.
Yeah, you lay this out obviously in the book, but a part of what you're documenting here is the process by which a very complicated tax bill came into being almost overnight. And with so many different moving parts that many of them didn't get scrutiny, and opportunity zones, which had started as a bipartisan idea, people who we don't associate with sort of billionaire capital like Jared Bernstein, being the Biden administration CEA member, being an early proponent and architect of this, and then it becomes a thing that Senator Scott sells President Trump on and stays in the bill and makes it all the way through. And when it first passed, I think there was a lot of surprise and like you say from Vegas, just interest. I remember the several conferences I went to early on, just a lot of people really wanting to know, well, what is this and what's happening? And I would say in the beginning there was sort of this potential for two. There was this hope that it would be this great mover of money, but I think there are sort of two possibilities for how it could go wrong. One would be sort of what you're, I think, saying in the book here, which is the money is flowing, but to the wrong places, and it's just making a lot of rich people richer. And the other is not much money would flow at all. The possibility that like this just wasn't a very powerful incentive. So long wind up, but I think my question is, what do you think the evidence is that this is more the former than the latter? That there's been a lot of money flowing, but it's not going to the right places, as opposed to it just hasn't done very much yet.
Well, I think you're right that there's a question of how much money is flowing to these things. Mike Novogratz, who's be on later, has some of the best available data, but unfortunately, because of the process known as reconciliation in the Senate, with which we are now all increasingly familiar, a provision in the bill that would have required more reporting was stripped out. So we don't have very good data. There were some economists affiliated with the Joint Tax Committee of Congress who got access to most, though not all, of the 2019 Opportunity Zone Fund returns. And they found that 84% of the zones got no money at all, and half the money went to presumably the best off 1% of zones. But for now, unfortunately, a lot of the reporting is the kind of stuff that you and I and Rich do, which is going around and talking to people. So it's my anecdotal observation that while there are lots of projects that may have been accelerated by opportunity zones, there are many more that were in the works or might would have been done anyways, for which the Opportunity Zone program makes the project more attractive financially, but doesn't really do anything for the community. In one example of a loophole is there's a building going up in downtown Portland occupied by the local natural gas utility that was financed and built and leased to this utility with regular investment money. But because it didn't have a certificate of occupancy yet, they were able to sell it, and a bunch of people from who run an Opportunity Zone fund in Chicago were able to get a tax break for their clients for a building that really Opportunity Zone money had nothing to do with creating. So I think there's just too much anecdotal evidence of that to make me comfortable.
Well, so I think to push you a little bit on that, like how big of an actual hit to taxpayers do you think is in the ballpark here? I mean, there certainly right. With any government program, people tolerate varying levels of what we might think of as misdirected money. If the outcomes are worth it, right. What do the data suggest to you is the loss possibility?
Of course, the amount of money that the Treasury loses or foregone revenue depends on how many people take advantage of it, of course. And one of the difficulties is that the way the bill was structured cleverly, there's a little bit of revenue in 2026, and that makes the 10-year cost estimate look very small. So we really don't know how much money the Treasury will lose beyond the 10-year window when Opportunity Zone investors who have to hold their property for 10 years cash out. It's in the billions of dollars, I think. But look, I think the question is, if I believe that 90% of the money went to projects that really helped communities and 10% or even 15 or 20% went to projects that would have been done anyways in gentrifying neighborhoods, I would say it's a success. If it's the other way, that only 15% of the money goes to projects that are really what was intended, and the rest goes to projects that would have been done anyways or projects in gentrifying neighborhood, then it's a failure. And I don't think we really know yet how that is. One thing that is concerning to me, though, is when we propose programs that are aimed at poor people, there seems to be a great deal of focus in Congress in limiting abuse. We have to make sure that nobody gets the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit or food stamps who doesn't deserve it. We spend a lot of time on regulations and guardrails there. And then on a tax provision like this, it's just the opposite, that by design, there's just not very much oversight, not very many guardrails. And I think that's an imbalance that doesn't make any sense to me. If you're going to do something like this, you need to make sure, the government needs to make sure that it's being used more for the intended purpose and less just to cut taxes for people who happen to have capital gains that they can sink into an opportunity zone fund.
Now, to be fair to the Trump Treasury Department, there are guardrails. They do have, there are lots of things that when you talk to people who invest in opportunity zones, they have complained at many times about various iterations of the regulations that made it difficult to invest in, for example, operating businesses. So, but you think there should be a lot more, and that would not chill investment to such a degree that make it useless?
Well, you're right that there are a lot of regulations. I don't mean to suggest that there's not a lot of red tape here. But you can invest in almost any kind of property or asset in an opportunity zone. There's some provisions to make sure that you're not land banking and stuff like that. And everybody who deals with the IRS always thinks that there's too much red tape. I do think that that there's a risk that if you make these programs too onerous, nobody participates. That's absolutely correct. On the other hand, previous place-based policies like the new markets tax credit, which the proponents of opportunity zones are less critical of than others, they have a set cap on how much money could go, and that forces a kind of rationing that only the best projects, or more likely the best projects, are to be solved. And so I would be willing, if you press me, to say I'd be willing to have fewer people putting money into these things if I thought the rules and oversight would direct more of the money for the desired purpose.
But the idea behind the program was sort of the opposite, right? Like, let's just have an unlimited avalanche of capital. And if it spills into some places that maybe don't need it, that's okay, because there's going to be so much of it that it's going to go into the places that do.
So I don't think there was that much money. And I think it was too easy for the money to go to places that don't need it. I mean, one way the law worked was, as you know, Jim, 56% of the census tracts in America were eligible. The Treasury published that list. Then governors could choose up to 25% of those. Some governors chose pretty poorly. Some governors probably chose corruptly. Austin asked for 4 opportunity zones. The state, for some reason, gave them 21. And Austin is not a place that needs a lot of tax incentives to get investment. 25% of the opportunity zones in New York State are in Baltimore. The governor of California originally designated the Stanford campus as an opportunity zone, but because they published their list, there was an uproar, including from the Economic Innovation Group, the proponents of opportunity zones, and they undid that. So I think there are things that could have been done to direct the money in the right direction without hurting the things. I may have misspoken. I meant to say that 25% of New York State's opportunity zones are in Brooklyn, which is a pretty hot place to invest.
Yeah, I was worried I had missed an important geographical switch.
Sorry.
No, but the places that are getting money, the JCT economist analysis you're talking about, it does show that the places that are getting the money are still. It's not like these are going. The money has mostly gone to incredibly rich areas. They're still poor areas. They're just not as poor as the poorest areas in the zones, right? Those are the ones that are just not getting capital.
Well, on average, opportunity zones are poorer than other census tracts. That's true. But some of the data, I think, is misleading because the neighborhoods have improved quite a bit since the data that was used to designate the opportunity zones. But you're right. Although there are some places that when you go to them, you say, is this really what we had in mind? I mean, I gave you as an example, downtown Portland. The state of Oregon made a conscious decision that if they designated only the worst neighborhoods in Oregon, they wouldn't get any money. And if they get designated places that qualified because there are not very many people who live there, but those people are poor because they have preserved some low-income housing, that would be, might get them bad headlines, but they might get some money. So they kind of did it 50-50. They said, half the zones, let's put it in places that, like downtown Portland, that are already attractive, and maybe we can supercharge the investment. And let's put half the zones in remote places in Oregon that are desperate for money. And from what I can tell in Oregon, almost all the money went to the former. And I visited an immigrant community outside of Portland called Rockwood, which organized to get some opportunity zone money and got very little. I went to Bend, Oregon, which is, a resort town that's just booming, in part because people have left downtown to go live there during the COVID thing. And it seems strange that they may qualify legally, but it didn't seem like a very poor place. But you're right. The richest neighborhoods in America, Beverly Hills or Northwest DC, did not get opportunity zones. But I'm saying that the places that got the money were not the most needy in most cases.
So the Obama administration is looking, or sorry, the Biden administration is looking at how to do, regulations moving forward that might try to improve the performance of the program. One of the questions is, should there be, a change in this criteria for what qualifies? Do you think that would help solve the problem? What would be effective interventions from the administration at this point?
So you're right that the Biden administration, President Biden during his campaign promised to reform opportunity zones. But as far as I can tell, they haven't made any significant proposals, either in all the legislation they've sent to the Hill or in regulations. And so some of this may require action by Congress. Last time I checked, although people like Rich would know better, there's nothing in the reconciliation bill that would address any of the issues. We have a panel later of people who know a lot more about this, but at the very least, there are some zones that should be de-designated. Maybe you have to grandfather them. So more attention to what was chosen. I think we need better reporting. I think we need to rule out some things that should be added to the list of businesses in which you can invest. And I think we need to find a way to have some kind of oversight certification process, even if that is going to constrain the amount of money going in, because the natural tendency of people in the markets, people who have money, is to look for the highest return, lowest risk investments, and that may not be directing them to the places where opportunity zone monies are supposed to go.
And there's also the question of, how do you get a critical mass of investment? It's one thing for someone to come in and rehab a building in a very rural, left behind part of Eastern Oregon. It's another thing for 15 people to come in and rehabilitate an entire section of a downtown and just try to really throw some momentum behind it. And I know there are some cities that have tried that sort of bunching approach, like Erie, Pennsylvania. Do you think there's any sort of lessons from the few places that out there? I mean, maybe not even few, the places out there that really seem to be trying to have a concerted strategy on this?
I think that there was an effort to get a lot of communities to write prospectuses to market themselves better. And I think that in many cases, that may not have produced much opportunity zone money, but it did help organize the community to do better at economic development. I think there are places, Erie, Pennsylvania is one you mentioned. Alabama has done some interesting things. So I think there are places that have taken advantage of it. And that was part of the design of the program, I agree, was to put the onus on local communities to market themselves. I just think that making a shiny prospectus saying, come invest in my city, hasn't worked terribly well. I spent a lot of time in Baltimore, for instance, where they have a foundation funded an opportunity zone coordinator, a guy named Ben Siegel, who seems to me to be doing a terrific job at trying to market it. And for the most part, the neighborhoods in Baltimore that most need money don't seem to me have gotten very much, despite all his efforts. And Baltimore is the kind of place that opportunity zones were designed to help.
I want to zoom out for my last couple questions here and sort of talk about the broad themes of the book and sort of the influence of the powerful in Washington, which obviously I think everyone who's tuned into this is interested in. It's with the tax bill, it's interesting. You're focusing on a provision that truly was sort of brainchilded by a think tank set up by a very rich person. But the biggest benefits of the tax bill went to big corporations that very openly lobbied for, a corporate rate increase that has enriched shareholders around the country. It's less sexy, but it's a lot more money. And I'm curious sort of what that tells us about, how Washington works and what gets covered.
Well, you're right. I mean, when you have a huge tax bill like the Tax Cuts and Jobs bill, there are going to be things that are so small that they get ignored. I mean, I think you were the first reporter to write about the fact that opportunity zones were in the tax bill, and that was a full month after it passed. I think, yeah, obviously big corporations lobby successfully. There's no doubt about that. But I think this is an instance of a sort of a rifle shot where one determined billionaire, who I should mention, tells me he hasn't invested any of his own money to take advantage of the tax break. I do think he really thought he was doing a good thing, managed to get something in the bill that wouldn't be there otherwise. And Tim Scott, as you know, is key to this. Tim Scott, the Republican senator from South Carolina, one of 4 senators who was helping to write the tax bill, that he made this his priority. And there's a great scene in the book about how after President Trump made those unfortunate remarks about people on both sides being good people in Charlottesville, Senator Scott goes to the White House at the president's invitation, expecting to have a confrontation because Senator Scott has been so strong in his language in public about condemning the president's remarks. The president listens, does not antagonize him, and finally says, "What can I do to make it up for the people I've harmed?" And Tim Scott says, "Well, you can back my Opportunity Zone bill." And the next day, President Trump on Air Force One tells reporters, "Whatever that thing is that Tim Scott is doing, I'm in favor of it." And it was only then that the Trump White House got behind it. So Sean Parker couldn't have done this alone. It took a guy like Tim Scott to make it law. But I think that because of the way it was done, and because Sean Parker and his think tank had the ability to hire some really smart technicians to figure out just how to structure this so it doesn't appear to lose much money in the first 10 years, they managed to get a bill through Congress that it would have been hard for me or you or even some think tank to succeed at getting through. And I think that is a story about how money and power can buy you influence.
That's great. One more quick question, and then I'll let you move on to your own interviewing. But back to the writerly questions. You've written, your past books, monetary policy. You've sort of dove very much into sort of the way the macro economy works. Was this fun for you? Was this a change?
Well, this was a blast. My only regret, as I said earlier, is I couldn't travel. Talking to people who actually build things, businesses and buildings and finance them, and people who spend their lives trying to improve the lives of people who live in left behind communities. I mean, that it got me out of the quiet halls of the Brookings Institution to talk to people who are really on the ground doing stuff. So that was fun. One thing that's awkward is that I talked to a lot of people who I think are disappointed with the point of view I took in the book and may feel a little bit like I misled them. I don't think I did. I think like any reporter, I listened and I didn't talk a lot about my views, but a book has a point of view and I expressed it when I wrote it. So I've had some nasty conversations with some people and that's painful, but it comes with the job.
David, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it. I invited Martin Muoto to join us today because Martin Muoto is, first of all, just a fascinating guy doing a fascinating thing. Martin was born in Nigeria. He went to Wharton. He worked in private equity, which we won't hold against him. He dabbled in real estate on the side, buying undervalued apartment houses in South LA, Watts, Compton, South Central LA, and fast forwarding, that led him to build this enterprise there called SoLa Impact. It's the largest Section 8 landlord in LA. I think they have 1,500 units. They have an impressive social service operation on the side for their tenants. They have an incubator known as the Beehive in some old brick warehouse buildings in South LA. It's really an impressive thing. But the reason I invited him is this, that in 2014, SoLa Impact raised $10 million to buy and renovate 35 buildings. In 2017, they raised over 9 months, $55 million from wealthy investors and other institutions. But in 2019, they were persuaded that opportunity zones gave them a huge advantage. As I understand it, they were a little resistant because getting in bed with the government was not something they had planned. And after they formed an opportunity fund, they raised $115 billion in just 12 weeks in 2019, all of which is going for affordable housing. And then because they don't seem to be people who rest on their laurels, in December 2020, they said they were going to raise up to $500 million for opportunity funds to be used outside LA and another $500 million to invest in opportunity in poor neighborhoods that not opportunity zone money. So I thought Martin is a good example of someone who has figured out how to use opportunity zone money for its intended purpose, but also has seen that how the industry works from the inside and has some ideas about where it's working and where it isn't. So Martin, with that long introduction, thank you for joining us and getting up early in LA.
Thank you
So
for having me.
first of all, if I did violence to your story there, I hope you'll correct me. But mostly what I want to know is, when you first heard about opportunity zone provision, what did you think? And how has it worked out for SoLa Impact?
When I first heard about it, I associated it with the classic LIHTC and other government programs, new markets tax credits that have been very complicated and we have avoided, namely because we've seen that they drive up the cost of building affordable housing. I think it's become common knowledge that a lot of those developers are building at $500,000, $600,000 a door, and we've always felt that's not really affordable. And so that was the initial. As we looked at it, we realized that a lot of South LA, although only about half to a third of South LA is in opportunity zones, as you point out, it should all be in the opportunity zone census tract, but only a third to half is in opportunity zones. And so we decided to raise a fund, and as you point out, we were maybe very fortunate. Maybe we got the timing right, but certainly we had a track record of investing in very poor areas in Los Angeles. As some of you may know, South Central really has this 30-year plus notorious history and stigma, and it's 98% of our tenants and the community are African American and Hispanic, and our average tenant earns less than $30,000 a year. So that was our initial introduction. I will mention that, while I'm super pleased to be speaking with you again, and I know you've done a tremendous amount of work in your research, we were quite loath to be one of the poster children of the opportunity zone, because while it certainly has a lot of merit, I think that your book also looks at it in a very tough-minded way and in somewhat skeptical way, and that in some respects is justified.
So elaborate on it a little bit. How do you think it's worked out for the real estate industry in general? What's been your experience in talking with other people in the real estate industry about how it's shaping?
I think there's a couple of things I would point out. First of all, we're not policy, we're not thought leaders. I'm pleased to be among thought leaders here, but we're practitioners and we're action leaders. And one of our central tenets is that we never let the good enough be the enemy of the perfect. Certainly, this is not a perfect bill, but we've found that it did a number of things. Number one is that it forced a 10-year time horizon, and anybody in private equity or investments knows that trying to get investors to hold an investment for 10 years is a challenging thing, and therefore that mandated it. And so I didn't have to negotiate with my investors around the whole period. The second thing that it did was, which is very important to point out, is that it required a significant improvement or a substantial improvement test, which means that you couldn't buy a performing building and simply sit idly by for 10 years. And very importantly, in LA, which is not an easy place to build, we had bought 1,500 units. We had rehabbed about half of them. It's very challenging. We bought some of the toughest buildings, and we did real heavy lifting to turn them around, and did that in a lot of cases. Some cases we stubbed our toes, and but what the substantial improvement test did was allow us to build. And so we owned 1,500 units, but we hadn't added one unit to the housing stock of Los Angeles. And because of the opportunity zone substantial improvement test, we could go to prospective investors and say, we intend to do a lot more ground up development, which many folks consider as more risky. We try to de-risk it, but it changed that perspective. So that was the second thing. And the third thing, very candidly, that is that while certainly it could be criticized because it is, primarily advantages people with significant capital gains, which happen to obviously be usually very rich, is that, in our first two funds, we had approached some institutional investors, foundations, nonprofits, endowments, and many times, in fact, all the times until that point, folks said, well, it's just, this is too risky. And now we were able to raise $115 million in our third fund from private individuals who simply were motivated for whatever the reason might be, but allowed us to do the work that we have been doing in South Central.
So if I know you say you're not a policy person, but I think policy people can benefit from learning from people who actually are on the ground. So what do you think would make it more likely that there was more money going to SoLa impacts sort of things, as opposed to some of the things I talk about in the book, the office towers and hotels and stuff?
Obviously, look, we've got a dog in the fight, and so I appreciate the question. And without being self-serving and having given the bill, some degree of thought, the first thing we would do, which I believe EIG and others have really advocated, is what I call the +10 -10, which is to retire 10% of the more egregious census tracts. And to add or allow states and cities and municipalities to add new census tracts and recalibrate that. So in fact, it'd probably be a +20 -20, but certainly that would be one. I think we have always been big advocates of reporting. We publish a social impact report. Reed Thomas and others have really done a great job of putting more precision into that methodology. And so I think reporting is key. This is very unlikely to happen, but quite frankly, we would democratize the tax advantage rather than making it simply for capital gains. Quite frankly, we met especially in Los Angeles. I don't want to be a name dropper, but we met with a lot of celebrities and a lot of Black and brown and entertainers that had made money in the entertainment industry, but did not have capital gains simply because, or just found it difficult to access their capital gains because they didn't make money in the stock market or didn't make money in traditional private equity. So, I'd almost make it open to more ordinary income, although I think that might be a bridge too far for most folks.
Well, I think that's a good point. I think, Martin, let me ask you one final question. I'm interested in your impression. I gave mine, so you know what I think. Do you think that the bulk of the money in opportunity zones is going to things like the ones you're doing, or is the bulk going to things that might have been done otherwise? Do you have a view on that?
I candidly don't know. I would say that, look, there's a significant percentage that is going to what most of us would scratch our heads up in terms of, hotels with swim up pools and luxury things like that. But I think, again, being in a community like South Central Los Angeles, it has been a boon to us. It has also been, mixed. Some community members feel and some community groups feel, because we embraced the opportunity zone legislation, we embraced, the Trump administration, which could not be further from the truth. We did allow, HUD Secretary Carson to come down and visit, and we had a lot of arrows in our back because so somehow we were associated with that. But I would say that it has really, it has helped us do really important work, and it has helped others, Erie and Alabama and dozens of others. So we don't have the luxury of, looking at it that way. And I think a point you made earlier, which is really important, which is that the tax set-asides for poor people, food stamps, EBT, Section 8 programs get a tremendous amount of scrutiny and regulatory involvement. And I think that, it is really important that we continue to find ways to drive capital into these markets. And so we're convinced that it has worked, but certainly there have been others that we would prefer not to get too close to.
I see. Okay, Martin, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I admire the work that you're doing out there. Let me remind the audience as we go to our next panel that if you want to ask a question, you can either send it on Twitter, #OpportunityZones, or to a website called Slido, SLI.do, #OpportunityZones, or email events@brookings.edu. and we'll try and get to some of them. So now I'd like to turn to the final part of our session today. A number of people have asked, Jim included, like, how would you fix opportunity zones? And I've thought about it, but I'm not very confident in my opinions. So I thought that would be interesting to assemble a bunch of experts who to answer the question, can opportunity zones be fixed so they do their reach their intended audience? And if so, how? And so I've invited my former colleague at the Wall Street Journal, Rich Rubin, to moderate this panel, since, like any good reporter, he hasn't expressed his views on this as aggressively as I have. Rich has been the US tax policy reporter for the Wall Street Journal in Washington for the past 6 years, and thus has been very busy. There's been a lot of tax policy for the last 6 years. But he doesn't limit himself to print. He's made a number of videos about tax policy, including one where he went to a farm and he had live cows to discuss a piece on sacred cows in the tax code. So I recommend that to you. So the panelists I've asked to be here today are really a great group. Annie Donovan is the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at Local Initiative Support Corporation. And importantly, she was the head of the Treasury Office on Community Development Financial Institutions from December 2014 to December 2018. So she was there when some of this was being put in place. Brent Theodos is a senior fellow and director of the Community Economic Development Hub at the Urban Institute, another think tank in Washington, and has done a lot of thinking and work on opportunity zones and similar programs. Reed Thomas is the managing director of JTC Americas, which he joined when it acquired the firm he was with before, NES Financial. And they're very active in providing administrative and other services to opportunity zone funds and others. And as Martin mentioned, he's been working on trying to find a way to get funds to report their social impact. And finally, but not least, Michael Novogradic is the managing partner of Novogradic, an accounting firm which was very involved in the shaping OZs from the start and continues to be involved in organizing people who have views about this and connecting them with legislators and regulators, and runs a number of good conferences on opportunity zones that I benefited from attending when I was working on the book. So as I say, you can pose questions on Slido, Twitter, or send us an email at events@brookings.edu. With that, I'd like to turn the page over to my friend, Rich Rubin.
David, thank you, and thanks to all the panelists for being on this. I enjoyed the book a lot. I encourage all of you to read it and get sort of the full view of what my stories and Jim's stories sort of can't fully cover. David's book has the whole picture. So we're going to try and use this panel to kind of look forward somewhat and talk about what changes might be considered. So we'll start with Annie, and I was curious if you were at the Treasury Department now, what would you do? What would your sort of priorities be in looking at the program?
Well, thank you, Rich, and thank you for having me here. And congratulations on your book, David. When you were describing all the colorful characters, you left out the brothel owner. So I'll leave that to the audience to figure out where that character fit in. If I were at the Treasury now, well, let me say, I was at the CDFI fund. I was the director of the CDFI fund. And I want to just provide a little context around what that means. For many in the audience may know community development financial institutions and what we do out there in the world. And we are mission first investors. So we operate at the intersection of people and place. And we are very concerned with economic mobility and opportunity, across the spectrum in low-income places, particularly those that have suffered concentrated poverty over decades. And so this program, I think, one of the data points I think we could add to whether or not this program works in the context of not having a whole lot of data is to say, how does this tool connect with that community development finance infrastructure? Because we're the ones who are out there who are really getting the deepest in terms of impact. And I would say for our sector, this does not work. So I think that there are many other tools that do work, many other ways to use tax policy. If we're talking about tax policy and how that can help people in communities, I'd much rather see it directed toward programs that already have evidence that work. And I don't see the bones of, somebody said this is a bridge too far. I think this program is a bridge too far, and I don't think it is ever going to connect in a meaningful way to the people and places that need it the most. And so that's, I think our tax dollars are better directed elsewhere.
Thanks. I almost wonder if it's like, it feels like it was sort of described as a program that's aimed at the places that need it the most. And if we conceived of it as a program that's aimed at places that were already moving and need a little bit more kickstart, it might sort of feel more successful than it is, because that's what it is. Michael, what are I know you get your group, and you've been sort of talking to a lot of investors and people who've been trying to use the program. What are the main changes you've been seeking from the Treasury Department, and what can kind of happen now to tailor this program in a direction that that you'd want to take it, that investors, that communities might want to take it?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Rich, and thanks to the Brookings Institution for inviting me to participate here. I would probably not label this as how to fix it. I would say how to improve it to even better be able to deliver on its stated intent. That would be my focus. And we have been working through our Opportunity Zones working group and providing feedback to Treasury as well as to Congress in terms of how to design. And there's a lot of asks that we have. In the course of the regulatory process, many of them did make their way into the regulations. Unfortunately, there's a couple of areas that our recommendations didn't make their way into the regulations. And in part, it was the guardrails, as the regulations were interpreting what these guardrails were that are built into the statute. They ended up becoming so substantial that much of the investment that could be going into affordable housing isn't going in. And we have a number of recommendations, regulatory changes that we think would really enhance the ability to use opportunity funds to invest in affordable rental housing. So that's one area that we have a number of recommendations. And I'd love to go into them all, but I won't go into the detail of them. I could get wonky as a CPA, but we have letters to Treasury on our website for folks. The other area is operating businesses. I think there are a number of interpretations that the regulations included that limited the ability to invest in equity capital in operating businesses. So those are two areas where I would love to see some of the recommendations that we've been making get incorporated into the regulations so that opportunity funds can be all that they have the potential to be.
And Brett, I know you've sort of written a lot on place-based policies. And how do you sort of compare this with other ones that the government has? And is this something that's adjustable, changeable, fixable, whatever term you want to use, or is it time to just start over?
I think of this as more akin to a 1031 exchange or to an EB5 type program than I do the low-income housing tax credit or the new market tax credit. And so, it's more like a mortgage interest deduction, right? It's a by right. There's no competition. There's no constraint on who can use it. There's very little constraint on what it can be used for. So it's very open-ended. And that means we got a lot of actors doing a lot of different things in very different parts of the country. So when I think about how much juice we're getting for our squeeze, I think there are some ways that we could get some more juice for our squeeze. And I'm certainly not opposed to the idea or the potential of driving capital to needy places. The ironic thing to me about opportunity zones is it's actually a somewhat shallow subsidy, despite how expensive it is and how much attention it gets. I mean, you talk to developers all across the country and they'll tell you It doesn't make a bad project good, it makes a good project better. This is the phrase you will hear over and over again. And what that says is, unlike the low-income housing tax credit or the new market tax credit, it's not really making projects happen that wouldn't happen otherwise, at least not at all to the same degree. And so I'm actually open to a new OZ 2.0 that is actually a bigger subsidy, a deeper subsidy, but actually accomplishes social goals. I mean, the paradigm of opportunity zones is money for communities equals good. And you can imagine in a neighborhood that doesn't have a grocery store, that doesn't have a gas station, that doesn't have a Walmart, that, investment equals good. But those communities aren't getting OZ money. And so the kind of communities that are getting OZ money, money doesn't equal good. Money for affordable housing equals good. Money for investments in small businesses owned by people of color equals good. But money period doesn't equal good. So there's several specific ways that we can see small businesses able to get investment, that we can limit it to housing that has some affordability constraints, that we can, I agree with the comments from Martin earlier, we can broaden who is able to invest. And most fundamentally, for Annie's point, we can really target and allow mission-driven funds to be able to make use of the incentive.
And Reed, I'm curious how you've seen investor interest change over time, sort of from what people were looking at and thinking about this program as it first rolled out in 2017, 2018, to kind of how it's viewed by investors now.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. It's been very interesting. Our company was founded on this idea that there's these well-intended initiatives that get created, and sometimes they fail to achieve the good they're intending to do. And it's funny, Brett mentions 1031 exchanges and EB5 because that's kind of where we grew up with these initiatives, and this narrative starts to form that the program is failing to achieve its goals, and so that's kind of what this whole discussion is about. Yet from the onset, we've seen investors with tremendous interest in making a positive impact. We've run, as was said, we run administration services for fund managers. Another part of our business is we deal with private clients and high net worth investors. And from the onset, we've seen both sides of it. Folks trying to raise capital, doing well-intended things, trying to make a difference. We've seen investors from the onset wanting to make a positive impact. About 30%, about a third of the investors that we see rate the impact element of this initiative as the primary driver for their investment. And the rest is sort of split between, hey, I want to get a tax break, or I want to get a positive return on my investment. So really, it's at least as equally important to investors as the other elements. And I think that gets missed a lot. On the fund side, the program was criticized early on because of the amount of real estate activity that was going on and the lack of operating business activity that was going on. I know in Mike Novogradic's working group, there's been a lot of good suggestions on how to improve the elements of the operating business, make it better for investors or easier for investors. But the truth is, we've seen projects form at a rapid rate. The number of operating business related projects out there, or funds that are out there, is now, in our view, and we have a sample size of about 300 or 400 opportunity zones because we have well over 100 now are clients of ours. So I think it's representative of general trends. About 50% of the funds out there have an operating business element to them, but we haven't seen capital yet flow in that direction. So we are seeing the motivation on the side of investors and funds to actually could do the things that are consistent with the intent of the initiative.
In a big picture sense, the opportunity zones have always been, as I think Brett said, the sort of a flexible, open-ended, by right kind of program where you check a couple of boxes and you get a tax break. And I think some of the questions we're getting from the audience and some of the criticism that's come of it is that it's not necessarily helping people in the zones, and sort of trying to think about things that are more prescriptive. Can you have incentives that are, the incentive goes up if you have more operating businesses or benefits for residents or any of that. So I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on, whether some of those ideas about trying to require more, incentivize more to get more prescriptive, how to balance that with the open-ended nature, which I think is probably what attracts the capital, at least in part in the first place. I don't know, whoever wants to start on that would be fine.
Well, I can go. I think I can start from a basic perspective. The changes that we're trying to make here through this initiative are going to take a generation to make. I mean, this is not something like, I just had the utility service upgrade in my house. It took me over a year to get that done. David was talking about the first event he went to was in May of 2019. We're talking about making changes in these communities, and we're a year and a half in realistically. So it starts to me with measuring impact and measuring the little things that are going on along the way. And we could talk about it later, but I want to give the other panelists an opportunity to answer your question. But there's many things that can be done that aren't overly cumbersome, that can be measured and proven along the way to show that we're on the right track. Because at the end of the day, this program is going to be judged by the good it was intended, those kinds of metrics. So measurement is key.
And I would just say that I totally agree with, looking at the incentive and finding ways to design it, both regulatory and statutory changes to make it even better. But I also think that so much of the view of opportunity zones is based on anecdotes. And my step one would be, we've got to get reporting in place. Either Treasury has to look at the statute and say, we're supposed to come up with certification process. And as part of that certification process, we're going to mandate collection. Congress just has to pass a rule, pass the law. The law originally had reporting in it. And because of the arcanery of the Byrd rule and the rest that got pulled out, we need data. So one of the frustrating parts about opportunity zones for me is you can look at the geographic investment data and look at it as bad or good. You can look at the investor data and look at it as bad or good. And critics on either side can look at it and see positives, but we need more data and not competing and battling anecdotes.
I'd like to just weigh in with what our experience is. And I think in the industry, in the community development, community investment industry, people were excited about this initially because any new resources that can come to our community, we want to have that investment come our way. And I think we were all open to maybe we've missed something here in terms of this type of investor who, there's a big open field here, and maybe we've missed something about what their motivations are and what they'd be willing to do and how that might impact our communities. But I think what happened along the way is that there was the type of investor who was coming to the table did not connect with the motivations of the people in my practice. So they may have said, of course, who's not going to say, I want to do good in the world? And I happen to think that a third of people coming with that motivation maybe is not a good indication of success. And then I think the investors who were coming to the table had networks, and they have, whatever their networks are that connect them to money and to investment were not the networks that connected them to communities. So communities didn't know how to connect back in, and their normal intermediaries like a LISC or an enterprise or others, CDFIs, couldn't find the eye of the needle to put the thread through. And it turns out that this universe of investors is very small. And I loved Martin's idea of let's democratize this. Let's democratize the tax benefit so it's not just tied to capital gains, because that turns out to be too narrow a window with investors who were too narrowly motivated, and a product that the only way you make money on this is if you have a capital gain, and that means there has to be an upside, right? And a lot of what we do is try to financially engineer in a situation to get capital to places where there's not an upside, where the market doesn't go because the risk reward doesn't work out. So how do you fill that gap? And this turns out to not be a gap filler. And that's why I think it doesn't get at what's really needed if we're going to move the needle for people and places that Tim Scott was talking about that really need it. You don't see it. And the other problem with it is the mechanism is clunky. So you have to have a 10-year investment. You have to invest your capital gains within 180 days. There's all these timing constraints. And so you don't have the luxury. Those of us who do the deals at the ground level know that they take time, they're hard, they're long, they're heroic journeys. They shouldn't be, but they are. And it's really hard to do a multi-asset fund as a result. So you have to tie, each deal to an investor. And, I think that impacts scale and access for the communities that we're working in and the work we're trying to do.
Yeah, it's like very flexible, but also in some ways inflexible because of some of those deadlines. Brett, did you want to jump in on this?
Just quickly, at the project level and then at the neighborhood level, I think the challenges. The project level, what we heard is, a lot of mission projects or impact projects might be able to give an 8% or a 10 or a 12% rate of return. But what investors are often seeking, that we're hearing as they go to market, is they want 15, 16, 17% returns. And those are just a fundamental misalignment. So somewhat ironically, when we see opportunity zone finance projects actually being impact or mission projects, it's only because they're leveraging other subsidies. It's when they're drawing in low-income housing tax credits or new market tax credits or state subsidies. And
or
so,
if I might add, Brett, some investors who for whom that's not their hurdle rate. So investors who are coming into this, I talked to an investor just this past week who's a hospital system, and they are a social investor and they have capital gains. And so they're going to do the right thing with this. And they're going to do the deeply affordable stuff that is that's beneficial to the community because they're mission driven. And so that's the eye of the needle. But there aren't that many actors like that out there. Sorry,
right.
Brett.
No, absolutely. When we're talking about moving the capital off the sidelines, like we're talking about how do we motivate the profit motivated investors, right? We already have a lot of tools that are helpful for the mission-minded investors, but how do we get the profit-minded investors off the sidelines? And when I think about what success is, I think about it at a community level. And in some ways, unfortunately, it's not that special to be a zone. There's 8,700 plus zones. So why would you put your money in West Virginia when you can go to Brooklyn or Oakland or Manhattan next to Central Park? You wouldn't, or at least on average, most people don't. And so in an odd way, there's actually way too many zones because then there's not scarcity. There's not a need. When you're at a zone, you've developed your prospectus and you say, hey, look, I'm a zone. There aren't people that are really that necessarily interested simply because you're a zone. And so to really accomplish change at a place-based level, the figure that I'll just throw out based on some research that I'm doing of big place-based development work is we need to be somewhere between 500 million and $1 billion per neighborhood in new subsidized investment for different places to really move the needle. And one-off projects, whether they be new markets or LIHTCs or OZs or whatever, they're just not going to accomplish neighborhood change. So we need strategies that are actually going to be much bigger and much more concentrated in a community if we really want that community to be changing.
A lot of the early talk about opportunity zones was about urban neighborhoods, but it was also about rural areas. And I feel like I've not heard much at all about investing happening sort of like industrial parks in rural zones or warehouse districts or any sort of those kinds of big, sort of big investments in non-urban areas. If any of you have any thoughts on that or ideas about what are there projects I haven't seen or are missing, or like what's been happening in the less populated zones?
This was sold as a program that would create jobs in the heartland, and what it's doing is creating real estate on the coasts and in hot markets. But the fundamental challenge is what Annie got to is the big return, the real benefit is a capital gain, right? You have to have appreciation. And if you're in a rural market, and some rural markets are doing well, you're at the ski resort or where have you, but if you're in a market where land values are declining because population is going down, it's very hard to have land value appreciation. And so it's all the harder to get a gain. Plus deal sizes are smaller, so it's a lot more work. So there's lots of reasons apart from OZs that moving money to smaller and rural markets is hard, but it's also the fundamental nature of the incentive that it's tied to this appreciation. And if you don't expect a lot of appreciation in a rural market, then you're not going to see a lot of projects.
I just want to say, this kind of goes back to the need for data. And we definitely have, a number of clients that are investing in rural sort of communities through their opportunity funds. But, like I said, there's just not enough data out there right now. And we really need to get that data so we're not making policy choices based upon anecdotes.
Yeah, Amanda. I mean, we have clients, and they're mentioned in the book, right? Arcturus is making investments in rural areas. 4 Points Funding is making investments in rural areas. Those are both clients of ours as an example. So it's happening out there. But anecdotally is what we seem to be talking about, all of these other maybe egregious, maybe not, scenarios. But at the end of the day, right, it's about tracking and measuring the impact of these things. There are great projects doing great things in urban areas that are creating jobs. And why aren't we measuring and reporting on all the good things that this program is actually doing?
And just underscoring, the Trump administration made the decision to only keep the reporting on the tax form, which I think we can see was a strategic mistake, but one where they really didn't want to raise any barriers for investors to have to disclose in a way. But it's just to underscore the point that Michael made earlier, the Biden administration right now could make a certification process that has reporting as part of it. And we could actually know the answers to a lot of the questions that we're asking.
This is an audience question that's sort of somewhat a technical tax thing, but it's interesting to me. Different states have done different things about whether their state income tax allows the same opportunity zone benefits as the on top of the federal benefits or not. And so I'm curious if the question was basically, has that moved the needle on private investment? Have we seen more investment in states where there's, from investors from states where there's conformity and less where there's not?
I mean, I would just say the answer, generally speaking, is yes. Those with conformity will get more investment. But there's also, even beyond conformity, Ohio created a tax credit for investment in opportunity zones, which actually, from a policymaker's perspective, it had a dual benefit in that it did attract more equity capital to Ohio from opportunity funds, but also as part of claiming the tax credit, you needed to do reporting. So there's actually a lot of good analysis, and the Economic Innovation Group has done a great job of analyzing the data that's publicly available from Ohio to show, where the investment's going, what the typical investment level is for a given investor and the rest. So I encourage folks looking at that.
On the removing and adding zones, I'm curious, I think Michael had mentioned that maybe, and someone else said too, like how, particularly as we get more 2020 census data, the time changes, things change, investment happens, how should, and I guess Congress would have to do it, but like how should Congress think about whether and how many zones to add, or as Brett was talking about, to shrink so that you can really focus the investment in particular areas?
I think the proposal that was put out there I think the one thing you could start with is just lopping off the contiguous zones. And I think the idea there was theoretically, maybe not a bad idea, but in practice is not working. So, I mean, that's an obvious place to start.
No, I definitely agree with that. I think there's 100 to 200 zones that you would look at and say, they're not the spirit of the opportunity zone incentive. And, the law allowed governors to select, and the governors, I think many governors looking at some of the zones they picked, they themselves would like a do-over. So I think having that 100 to 200 zones that are contiguous tracts or otherwise above a certain median income, it would make sense to give the governors a do-over.
Yeah, and just to explain the contiguous zone things, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but basically there were income requirements for opportunity zones, but then governors could also select some that weren't too high income, but were next door, basically. And some of those are where the egregious, if you want to call them that, anecdotes and examples have come from. And it's funny, going back to the point that I think on the open-ended investment that that David made, like there's probably, if we thought of them like mortgage interest deduction as in the same way, like you could probably, there's like many like egregious examples of we're subsidizing this home. Why is this? Some of this is probably like on our fault on the journalism end of things, and some of it's the lack of data. But I'm curious about just the way this program is sort of seeped into public consciousness. What makes it similar or different in how it's thought about from something like mortgage interest deduction, state and local tax deduction, even something like the new markets credit, which is in some ways sort of less, it's been around for a while, so it's less known and less sort of front of mind for a lot of people. How has this sort of entered the public consciousness, and how has that shaped it?
I'm curious what others think about this, because I myself look at it and think, the 10-year score is roughly a couple $2 billion, which is a lot of money, but by Washington, D.C. standards, it's not a lot of money. And when you look at all the other incentives, it's dwarfed. And then maybe over 20 years, it's maybe, $4 or $6 billion. So it's not over a 20-year period, a huge amount of money, but it definitely, has been a lightning rod, in many ways good, because it's drawing a lot of attention to all these distressed areas. But it definitely seems relative to the cost, an extreme amount of attention.
I think the problem is in the cloak. So this is cloaked in, we're going to get this to distressed places and finally resurrect them. And that's not what's happening here. And if as a society, we want to create more opportunity and economic growth in these places, then let's not count this as money we're spending toward that impact. Let's count it toward the impact it actually is having, and not say that this is deep community development.
I think there also was, agree with that. I think there also was a disillusioning process. Community development finance field tried to figure this out and tried to make it work, and largely has failed to succeed. I think they were very sincere at the beginning in thinking that this was going to present a new tool that they can use, and largely it hasn't. So, I don't think we can fully divorce it from Trump and his vocal backing for that. I think this made it more controversial than it would have been otherwise. But I think fundamentally, we know that ethanol subsidies are ethanol subsidies. We know that the MID is just a way to give back money to wealthy people. And it really is that this represents something more than it's accomplishing, I think, is the fundamental rub here.
Well, I think it speaks to the issues of our time and maybe political divisiveness in the country and all of those things. I mean, it's fascinating to me to see how quickly the sort of the negative narrative on this initiative emerged. When really what we're talking about is something that is going to take a generation to have the impact. So and you measure 1 year into something that might take 25 or 50 years to really affect, and to say this thing isn't working, we repeal it. Honestly, I think is not fair and crazy. There's a generation coming up behind folks my age that is really, really passionate about impact investing, right? And we need to be thinking about it in those kinds of terms, and looking today at actual facts, not anecdotes, and saying, well, what are we actually seeing, and how can we tweak this to make it work? I don't understand why there isn't the patience for that in this kind of an incentive. Honestly, it's fascinating.
Were you saying that like the U.S. news media and politicians are not patient? I'm stunned. I have an audience question, and keep them coming in because we've got some nice ones. Basically says, look, there's no secret on how to improve these. That if you look at improve these, if there's the history sort of says to require community benefits, affordable housing, minority and women vendor set-asides, apprenticeship programs. What's the which would I think direct attempt to direct benefits to the people who helped the zones qualify as opposed to the zones themselves. How feasible is that, both politically, to the extent you can talk about that, and then also just programmatically what the sort of both investor and community interest would be in a program that would be more prescriptive and more detailed and have more requirements along those dimensions than what we have now.
Well, I think that if you go back to the premise, which David pulls out in his book of, what the theory of change here was, that if you had the part of the problem is that every time you add on those layers or those requirements, you're making it harder and harder and harder. You're narrowing down the window. And that's what was purported, that investors, if they don't have to deal with all that, then their money's going to flow. So I think there's a conflict there. And I wonder if the investors, well, I think we can look at there are lots of other programs that are out there that are targeted to those outcomes. And we don't see this set of investors showing up for that. So what makes us think we would get a different result if we shifted this?
I think that there's a good point in there, right? It's always trying to find the balance between how much complexity can we add to the initiative to make sure it's doing the things it's doing without preventing the flow of capital. And I think that's the tricky part of this. When we started looking into this, we became, because of our experience in EB5, actually, we were convinced that we're going to have to figure out how to do.
Explain what EB5 is.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's a foreign investor program where foreign investors invest into initiatives that are intended to create jobs in targeted employment areas, and in exchange for that, there's an immigration benefit at the end. So the issue with that is similar, right? There's all this perception about rich people getting richer and getting all of these benefits, but is it really having a positive impact on the community? And that program suffers from a massive amount of complexity and reporting. But when we approached opportunity zones, what we did was we really looked at how can you measure impact in a way that's not a burden to fund managers. And interestingly, there's lots of ways to do that, right? If you're involved in the flow of capital and how capital is moving and what it's being invested in, there are all kinds of algorithms and technologies. We've developed some that can calculate these things. And these are technologies that are used by government to determine the benefits of different programs. So you can actually do it in a pretty straightforward forward way. And all of our clients are doing that. We've bundled that into the solution set. But how do you take it to the next level and start to tweak it and enhance it without adding too much complexity?
I would just add that these are the debates Congress is going to have about the future of this program. And I think it really will depend on the constitution of that Congress in terms of what form it takes. Because the industry is not interested in it stopping at 2026, right? There's a benefit that's been created. People have now figured out how to use it and they are using it. And so there have already been legislation introduced that says, add extra time. So I think, it doesn't work to critique the we've run out of time line of reasoning, because people are saying we need more. We already know that this works and we need more time as well. And so I think it's really going to come down to Congress deciding how much just this tension, how scripted to be, how much we're going to say we are going to make sure that we get social benefit out of that. But I worry a little bit that we're still trying to contort something that doesn't fundamentally work, in the sense that if we say we want affordable housing, or we say we want this or we want that, the way the incentive works is that it works via appreciation. So if we don't anticipate use cases that result in lots of appreciation, we can add all these extra requirements onto what it's going to produce. And it's just not going to work, because the investor incentives are not aligned with the community desires of use cases. So we really have to more fundamentally change the incentive and the benefit, I think, if we're going to get some of those use cases we want to see.
And I would just add, if I could have $1 billion in tax money and put that to use as credit enhancement to substitute the equity investment that minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, for example, in distressed census tracts. Give us $1 billion. We will use it to substitute for friends and family in early stage investment. I'd much rather do that. And I think that would have greater social benefit.
I guess I would just say, I mean, I do think there are use cases that do work quite well. I mean, Martin with SoLa Impact is an example of that. And, in terms of sort of next steps, I definitely, would, as opposed to waiting on Congress and what legislation may or may not pass, I do think that there's a regulatory role during this sort of interim where they could come out, require reporting, also open up a dialogue for self-certifications in terms of what types of requirements and such might it make sense to put on opportunity funds. At the same time, change the regulations to encourage more investment in operating businesses in these zones, more investment in affordable rental housing. And that would be a great effort that can be done on a regulatory basis while we, while we debate what could or couldn't be done from a congressional perspective.
Some of you've alluded to them, there's sort of multiple overlapping federal incentives and programs here. There's spending side programs, there's the markets credit, there's the low-income housing credit, there's opportunity zones, there's state and city level programs. I want to start with Michael, but I'm curious what others think, because I think Michael often, helps people kind of package multiple benefits together so that to help turn projects that are, instead of good to better, to turn them from not doable to doable. So I'm curious for your thoughts on that, those multiple overlapping incentives, but then also if others have thoughts on whether that's just like too confusing and there's needs to be some sort of streamlining where you've got, the federal government pushing you in 4 different directions all at once here.
I mean, in terms of the confusion, because we get that a lot in terms of, these are too confusing, et cetera. And I always think, everything is confusing until you know how to do it. And after you've done it a lot of times, it's not confusing anymore. I've always thought, tax reform for individuals, just don't change the laws for 10 years. And then you'll learn what the rules are. It's all the changing rules that cause, all the complexities. So I look at the existing sort of incentives and they are complex outside looking in. But if you were to come to me and say, go deal with zoning regulations of a local government, that's really complex. So I almost feel like the complexity is a bit of a bad rap. That being said, I do think finding ways to streamline, there's never, you always want to find ways to make items less complex, but I don't think it's too complex. And there's lots of examples where folks have gotten very good at dealing with that complexity. They find the rules, what works and doesn't work. Just like when you're signing the papers on your home loan, they're really complex, but everyone does it a lot, so it doesn't seem quite so complex.
I would just say that Congress has different, issue areas and committees that people sit on, and it can be everybody wants their own thing, and so I don't see any streamlining potential in any near-term way, and also, we've basically decided, stimulus aside, that we don't want to spend money to improve communities. By actually spending money, we want to use the tax code. And so a lot of the social good that we try to do, not just for communities, but in general, now is through the tax code. And so that just makes things a lot more convoluted. And that's just where we're at. And I think everybody realizes that that's going to be the game in town still.
As we get closer to the end here, I'm curious if there are, besides what Martin has talked about in Los Angeles, are there places that you're watching, places that for whatever reason or fact pattern are doing this well or are taking this initiative that you all have some issues with in some dimension and are actually kind of directing it in the way that it's either intended or was sold, and where should people who are looking to counter some of those anecdotes, where should people look?
Well, we're seeing, I think, stuff happening everywhere, really. Initially, when the initiative started, we saw it in sort of the major real estate markets. Gradually, we've seen it activity migrate to all parts of the country, and we're seeing a very diverse set of investment opportunities out there. So there's, investment opportunities in women-owned businesses. That is an opportunity zone fund as an example, right? I mentioned some of the other ones early in Erie, Pennsylvania, or the Saddleback Mountain kind of examples. But we're also seeing sort of this idea of impact first becoming a trend, where funds that you might not think of as being impact oriented really highlighting the elements of what they're doing, the number of jobs creating. They're tying their real estate projects to, say, health centers or wellness centers, these kinds of things. We're seeing this behavior going on. And I think I think what could be done, right, is to really, this is an idea that I saw in the book and probably needs a lot more thought, right, is this idea of adjusting the incentive based on some degree of good that it's actually doing. Because there's this natural perception out there on the part of many investors that if it's an impact investment, I have to trade off return. And I don't think that's entirely fair. So I think some kind of maybe way to mitigate that, like tiering the incentive or something, is a good idea, but needs to be thought through.
In terms of where I would leave it, I'd say we could either target the incentive more to the very neediest places, or we could target it via institutions that are trusted mediators and represent community interests, like CDFIs or CDCs, or state HFAs do that through LIHTC or what have you. Or we could target it to use cases that are really the most valuable and productive, affordable housing or minority small business or what have you. So there's really three levers that we can push to try to make this program more of what we want it to be, whether that's by needy communities or trusted intermediaries or needy use cases. But really, this program is very open across all of those three dimensions. So really, personally, I'm open to any one of those being the point at which we can do a better job, but at least one, preferably two of them, is where I would push.
And I would just say, engaging in this sort of discussion, and kudos to the Brookings Institution for having this session today, because I think more of this discussion is what's needed. So we can look at the incentive and make it and improve it. And more dialogue, I think, would be better, and more action from the regulators would be useful.
Annie, any last thoughts before we bring David back in?
I would just say, I hope that Reed has a lot of success, and I hope that you bring those investors, that you cultivate them so they come along the impact investment spectrum more toward products and investments that, are going to really impact the people who need it most.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I think that's a challenge, is how do you get the awareness out of some of these great investment opportunities out there more broadly? So thank you. I think there's a tremendous opportunity here.
Great. Well, thanks to Michael and Brett and Reed and Annie for a really fun discussion. And David, will send it back to you.
Thanks very much. I want to say that I really think I accomplished the two goals I set for this morning's conversation. One is obviously to convince you all to buy and read my book, but the second is to provide an opportunity to have some serious conversation about a place-based policy like opportunity zones that I have my views, but I welcome the views of other people as to how it might be replaced or tweaked. And so I think we've accomplished that. 2 points in response to what was said. One is I was glad that people talked about operating businesses. I do think that Sean Parker, when he thought this up, thought more about money going to operating businesses and less towards real estate. I don't think it worked out that way initially. I think we'll be interested to see if there's more operating business stuff going on there. Some people tell me it's just not well designed for that, and other people see great potential, particularly if you can marry in a real estate investment with an opportunity with a business, operating business in the same location. I 100% agree that we need more data. And I really look forward to the day when we have enough data that some serious scholars can look at all this data and come up with some significant research that tells us whether this program worked as intended or not. I do want to defend anecdotes, though, for two ways. One is, like it or not, policy is often made by anecdote. And secondly, in lieu of data, anecdotes can help shed some light on that. But I agree that this is early days, and I've got an early cut on something that will take years to develop. But mostly, I want to thank all of the panelists today who participated, and my colleagues at Brookings, Megan Waring and Stephanie Sensula, helped organize this. We've learned that you can do really interesting things virtually, and I think this is an example. We have people from as far away as LA and as close as a few blocks from the Washington headquarters of Brookings participating in a conversation. And I do want to thank people who ask questions, and if we didn't get to them, send me an email, and if I can, I'll respond, or I can refer you to someone who does. Again, the book is Only the Rich Can Play: How Washington Works in the New Gilded Age. And we'll post this video on our website so you can watch it over and over and over again and get something new out of it each time. And finally, Annie, thanks for reminding me about the brothel owner in Reno, outside of Reno. That's a great detail. And if you read the book, you can find out what that's all about. So have a good day.